This is Marge Brown. On behalf of the American Federation of Teachers and Share My Lesson, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on podcast and public radio, using data to inform listening instruction. Wish I'd had this when I were teaching. My name is Marjorie Brown, and I'm an Assistant Director here in Educational Issues at the American Federation of Teachers, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Monica Brady-Meyerov and Dr. Scott Petrie, with this fascinating organization called Listenwise. You can read their bios on the right-hand side of your screen. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to hand it off to our presenters.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. I'm going to be starting off this webinar with my colleague Scott, and running the slides in conjunction with him and going back and forth. So as Marjorie said, I'm Monica Brady-Meyerov. I'm the founder and CEO of Listenwise, which is bringing the power of listening to the classroom with real-world audio stories that are connected to your curriculum. So Listenwise is the only listening comprehension program in the market, and that's why we're talking about listening today. And one of our favorite teachers using Listenwise is the man I'm presenting with today, Dr. Scott Petrie, a high school history teacher at John F. Kennedy High School in Valencia, California. He's also a Listenwise advocate. He's got a doctorate in educational leadership and a master's in education administration and lots of other great titles. But I want to get right into the first question we have to the poll to engage you all with this idea about listening, that I want you to share if you come from states that assess listening. So this is your first poll question. Do you come from a state that assesses listening? And some of you may know this right off the bat, and others of you may just be unsure, which is why we put that question in there. So I'm going to go to the poll results now. And the reason I ask you this question is because 19 states test listening. And it's tied into, most often, the SBAC, which is one of the two tests of the Common Core standards. Some of the major ones you might be from are California test listening, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Florida test listening, but they're not an SBAC state. But what's interesting to us is more and more states are testing listening every year. It's becoming a more popular skill to put on the high stakes test because listening is a standard in all 50 states, and it's being recognized as a really critical college and career skill. So I'm really excited for you all to join us today because we're going to learn about why it's important to teach listening. So this session will give teachers an overview of why teaching it is important. We're going to give you some free tools and resources on Listenwise that can support you and help you assess and track listening comprehension. You're also going to learn how podcasts can engage students around interesting content, and of course hear from a teacher, that's Scott, on how they teach listening and also use it to drive instruction using the data that they can get from Listenwise to inform their listening discretion. And at the end, you'll all leave with a free toolkit that includes strategy lessons for understanding vocabulary and the main ideas when testing listening. And I should also note that Listenwise is a free resource for teachers, so any one of you can get onto Listenwise and get your account and get started. So to kick off the session, though, I kind of want to do a little bit more quizzing around what you know about listening. Looking at some of these stats, I want you to kind of pay close attention to the 85% of what we learn through listening. When you think about the skills that go into, learning reading and every other skill that we learn, it all begins with listening. The other important and interesting thing I want to point out is that the students can read 2 grade levels, sometimes 3 grade levels. They can listen 2 to 3 grade levels higher than they can listen. So then they can read. I'm getting that all backwards. I don't know why, but I think you're listening well and understand my point that listening can be crucial to improving reading as well as increasing motivation and recall of material. So plays a lot of roles in learning. So that leads me to ask you all in another poll question here, is that whether or not you assess listening. As I said, it is assessed in many states, but I'm wondering if you do it on your own in the class or on a high stakes test, because we're going to talk about why it's important to do in just a moment, but I'm curious. So we're going to go to the poll answers now to take a look. Okay, nobody's answered it yet. Did I not give enough time? So I go back. I'm going to go back to that poll question. How do you assess listening? So you can answer this in terms of whether it's something you do on a state level test or in your classroom as a test, or something you've created on your own. All right, here we go. Yeah, so interesting. The majority of you ask them if they understand. This is common because there are so few ways to test listening and then use data from testing listening to inform instruction, that most of what I see happening in the classrooms is that you're not able to test it. You're trying to get a sense of it. It's really hard to tell whether somebody's listening to you. And asking them if they understand could be a simple yes or no, but as you all are aware, I'm sure many students just say yes and nod their heads and want to move on to the next thing. So we're going to go a little bit more into listening and how to assess it in just a moment, but I just wanted to get a baseline understanding of that. So I'm going to pass the presentation over to Scott now, who's going to talk a little bit about listening and learning.
All right. Thank you, Monica. This slide, I think, features an article I wrote over a year ago with my friends at Listenwise, and it really showcases two different ways to integrate listening into your regular everyday classroom instruction. We know from academic research that in order to be academically successful, students must leave high school with a working understanding of about 50,000 words. And good vocabulary teaching involves a lot of talk and practice with using language. Listening to academic vocabulary being used correctly is an important first step in helping students gain confidence before they start speaking and writing with these new words. And next slide. I'm sorry, Monica. I'm not
actually, Scott, I would
someone in a listening
workshop. No, you're doing a great job. I just see a little bit more on the slide to talk about social studies teachers, because you're not an ELA teacher, right? You teach social studies.
Oh, that's
and I know
true.
that.
I'm sorry.
Touching on that is important because I'm not sure what everybody teaches on this webinar, but I'm sure it's a variety of subjects, and listening can be taught in any one of them.
So many social studies teachers don't consider themselves ELA teachers, and they don't feel a need to teach listening. However, research from Marzano shows that 55% of the academic vocabulary students need for success in college is actually learned in social studies classes. So all these schools that have cut social studies curriculum back, they're seeing their reading scores drop, and it's because of that vocabulary fact. Listening is a key component of strong social studies instruction, and it's often integrated into the primary grades, but then it kind of fades away as students get older. Speaking and listening standards are kind of the forgotten part of the Common Core. Very few schools or districts formally assess them. A UCLA study found that a majority of social studies teachers struggle to explain how they help students develop their speaking and listening skills. And these teachers reported using small and whole group discussions regularly, but their students were rarely, if ever, assessed in their participation in those discussions. And only 15% of the teachers surveyed spoke confidently about their speaking and listening instruction. So to kind of wrap it up, the Common Core state standards include standards for grades 6 through 12 in literacy and history and social studies, science and technical subjects. And these are intended to guide literacy instruction, to sort of integrate literacy instruction across the curriculum. So addressing listening is a major part of that.
And also many research, thank you. Many research studies show that children who are better listeners are also better learners. So listening comprehension is related to reading comprehension as well. So improving listening can help improve reading. I already shared with you that students can understand text 2 to 3 grade levels higher when listening than when reading. So for students who are struggling with comprehension, auditory content can help close that gap. And they can also learn the meaning of unknown words through this incidental exposure to academic words in context when listening. The stories that we have on Listenwise provide a higher level of vocabulary that really stretch students' abilities and introduce them to words they may not know. Listening is just foundational to learning. Outside of decoding and phonemic awareness, listening comprehension is a major driver behind reading comprehension. And research shows that the two are correlated through adolescence. So there's tremendous opportunity here for teaching and learning, not just beyond the young grades. So I want to stress that because research shows this correlation goes all the way through the 8th grade and beyond. So if you're a middle school teacher or a high school teacher with struggling readers, think about how you can incorporate listening to help students learn higher level rigorous content and to learn academic vocabulary words that they may be lacking. Now, why do we love to listen so much to stories? You've probably all heard about the boom going on in podcasting. Lots of people are listening more to podcasts. And how does listening stimulate and even change our brains? The researchers who study how audio and radio affect attention and memory believe that listening requires more from the brain. After all, when you're listening to a story, rather than reading it, you must process the information at the same rate it's being presented. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how listening comprehension is this complex construct that depends on numerous cognitive and linguistic processes. Scott?
So I feel like I could add, I feel like a hypocrite here, and I should probably add that if my mother or my wife were listening to me participate and pretend to be an expert in a listening seminar, the laughter would be deafening.
All right, I'll laugh for them.
Thank you. So we know understanding is the goal of listening, and I would amend that to deeper understanding is the goal of listening. And teachers need to prepare students to actively listen, avoid distractions, and engage in conversations around what they just listened to. I taught a class with Eric Palmer a couple of years ago, and he really phrased it as engaging students in purposeful listening, where their teachers tell them what to attend to and where to focus their listening. We need to teach students what to respond to, how to respond, and when to respond. Fortunately, educational leaders are responding to this emphasis on college and career readiness skill. And what I found in my classroom is that audio stories can be used as instructional assets to address a wide variety of learning goals, including listening comprehension, but also building reading comprehension, and again, contributing to that deeper understanding, as well as many other common core skills, and of course the content standards we're expected to teach throughout the year.
So now let's move into some of the tools for teaching and assessing listening. As I said, I want to give you a little bit more background on Listenwise because we are the only listening skills building platform using mainly NPR stories as well as other podcasts to build these critical listening and literacy skills and content knowledge. And on the platform, we've curated over 1,600 stories in our collection, and they're all audio stories between 3 and 5 minutes long. They connect to what you're teaching in English language arts, social studies, and science. I see we have some other types of teachers on the call. I think what you'll just find are also really great stories that students want to listen to no matter the subject. We also have daily current events, so you can tap into that, whatever kind of teacher you are. And the lessons we have around ELA, science, and social studies are all standards aligned, and we offer a variety of resources, supports, organizers, and quizzes to help you integrate listening into your curriculum. And we're going to go a little deeper on some of that. But how does Listenwise improve listening? So, with the teaching resources, enhancing this listening instructions helps students develop a familiarity with the questions that are presented on state assessments and when they experience listening online. So if you're in an SBAC state and you're getting your students tested, I saw some of you are, and you know that they're being tested, giving students that practice of an online test for listening is really critical to their success, and we've seen that demonstrated in several of the schools we've worked with for over the years. But one of the things that Listenwise helps does is gives a range of complexities. So students practice listening to these nonfiction audio stories that have either a low, medium, or high language challenge level. That means the variety of difficulty of the vocabulary and the sentence structure. But they also have a lot of different accents and voices and perspectives. So it also gives them a depth of understanding. Students can acquire content knowledge and language skills by listening and completing assignments that require multiple levels of cognitive effort. And that ranges from understanding specific details to analyzing purpose and reasoning. So these stories on Listenwise target a wide variety of topics across content areas. And then close listening. You're probably all familiar with close reading. Well, close listening means listening to a story multiple times to help students focus on different listening goals and practice their listening comprehension. Finally, stamina and focus. Students build stamina as they increase their listening because, let's face it, students aren't good listeners. None of us are very good listeners. It seems like the research that we've read is that only about 10% of us listen effectively. So if you're shaking your head saying, Mike, the students don't listen, this will never work, they need to build stamina and focus. So as they are expected to master increasingly complex content, they also need to develop endurance and the ability to focus without being distracted to better understand listening.
And can I jump in before you move the slide,
yeah,
Monica?
Absolutely.
I want to say, as a classroom teacher, I observed my students the first year I was using Listenwise, and every time I hit play on the Listenwise story, I saw about 70 to 75% of my students automatically, reflexively reach for their cell phones. And what I learned over time is if I give them some front loading of telling them that, you know, their friends are still going to like them, they'll still be able to comment on their friends' posts, but for the next 2 to 5 minutes, they're going to put their phone away and listen with 100% of their abilities. What I noticed is that all but one of my students then gave it 100% attention and kept that. So pre-teaching how to listen helps students build their stamina.
Absolutely, and also telling them that maybe the type of listening you're going to be doing, because if you look at this list of the different types, the ones that are circled are what we're focused on here with listening and learning. So telling your students, listen for this and write down 3 details that you hear in the story, because we are doing precise listening. Or I want you to listen critically to this story and find the relevance of how this relates to something we discussed in class yesterday. Just helping them realize there are different types of listening, and getting some of these metacognitive strategies around recognizing what kind of listening they're employing, and as Scott suggested, setting up the right atmosphere for listening, telling them what's going to happen and to put their phones down will all help with better listening skills. So to go a little deeper into that, the guidelines for teaching listening involve setting the purpose. And actually, Scott, I'm going to let you speak to this a little more because you kind of touched on it, but how do you, besides telling the students to set down their phones and concentrate, walk us through what you do to set up a good listening lesson.
Well, a lot of students don't feel like they can control their listening. They feel like it's just something they're born with. And what you can do is tell them, yeah, there are certain ways where you can eliminate the distractions around you. And I've particularly seen this with, you know, a lot of teachers do this call and response thing, or when there's a speaker that has a rhetorical question, half the audience wants to shout out the answer to the question. So you have to set the stage and tell them that, okay, you're listening to this speaker, you're listening for these things, and so here's how we do it. We eliminate the distractions, we focus, and a lot of times I have them reading the transcript as they're listening to a Listenwise story. I find that that helps them understand the correct pronunciation of the words and helps them sort of listen between the lines a little bit.
Yeah, and all of the stories on Listenwise have interactive transcripts because the research shows how critical it is for reading, to help reading skills to be able to read and listen at the same time. So that's one feature that is very popular on Listenwise, to be able to play the audio and read along as you do it. Now, one thing we learned too is that, you know, it wasn't enough just to give supports around listening. Before Listenwise, there was really no way to assess listening. And online, at least, it used to be, and still, as many of you are doing, just taking a guess as to whether you think they understood it, or asking students, did you understand that? Because once you got your students listening, how do you know if they're really comprehending what they're hearing? Just like reading, listening involves many different skills. You may have a student who can answer a literal recall question, but can't really identify the main idea. Or perhaps you'll discover a student isn't able to make inferences when listening. But how could you discover that without the right assessments? So despite the fact that listening is part of the Common Core and many state standards, there hasn't been a way to assess and track listening and track those skills until now with our online listening assessment. So these quizzes give teachers real-time feedback and data so they can modify instruction accordingly. We test 8 key skills of listening comprehension. So what we've done is identified elements that we see in reading assessments because we know the important connection between reading and listening. And while listening and reading are both comprehension skills, the kinds of natural speech found in these audio stories, it's not as organized as a well-written essay with a topic sentence or linear progression of ideas. So students need to practice listening to identify and summarize the most important ideas in the audio. And also when students are listening to a speaker's voice, they can pay attention to the tone, the emphasis, and the pacing of the speech to make inferences or to identify the speaker's point of view. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is going to be our next poll question. So if you're first, I hope you've had a moment to look at all the skills that we assess on listening comprehension, because the poll question is going to be about that. Recognizing literal meaning, understanding vocabulary, making inferences, identifying main idea, summarizing content, determining point of view, analyzing reading and reasoning, and finding evidence. So, which listening comprehension skill do you think your students need to improve most? So we've given you all 8 of these here. Just take a moment to think, what is it that you think your students are most lacking in their listening skills? I'm curious to hear. All right, has everyone locked it in? Final answer, here we go. Understanding vocabulary, wow, all right, 100% are on that. That is no surprise because many studies show that one of the reasons why language learners especially are struggling to get reclassified out of learning English as a second language is academic vocabulary. It's also a huge struggle in reading. And for the benefits that it brings through listening are great that we know we can help with that. So let's move on to the next portion of the webinar where we're going to talk more about using the data that you can collect from these quizzes on Listenwise to inform your listening instruction. So as I said before, we have these close listening guide where we go deep and we ask students to really analyze a passage in multiple stages and for multiple things. Typically, our close listening guide has a first listen, a second listen, and a third listen. And in this one that I'm going to play and demonstrate for you is a way to really break it down, do some chunking of the audio to make sure you can assess for understanding from your students. So I'm going to play the first 33 seconds of the story. I'm going to tell you that.
Monica, before you start, can I jump in for 1 sec?
Absolutely, yep.
So from the classroom teacher's point of view here, I want to say to a lot of the first-time Listenwise users that you'll have this attitude like you want to skip this step and you don't want to stop it at 33 and say this, and you don't want to stop and ask a question. But when you do that and use this close listening guide, really you're doing a great job in modeling how to be an effective listener for your students. And I know a lot of teachers, they just want to grip it and rip it, to use a Gough slang term. They want to just jump in and hit play and be done and wait for the kids to take the quiz. But especially the first few times you use Listenwise, following a script like this is really helpful, because what you're doing is you're building in the steps for your students. And then after a couple of times, you don't need to do it anymore. But certainly the first few times, I would recommend following the directions. Again, something I'm not particularly good at myself, and I've learned the hard way from along the way.
Thanks for adding that. Yeah, and I'll say that what I'm going to model now is not a part of the online listening assessment. This is part of the scaffolded activities we have that are part of the teacher resources on a Listenwise lesson. So I am going to play the first part of a story that is an interview with Lois Lowry, the author of The Giver, and then I'm going to pause it and ask for to check for your understanding in a poll question. So here we go.
Just for a second, try to imagine a world without war, conflict, grief, or memory. Now that's the premise of Lois Lowry's novel, The Giver. Since it was published in 1993, it's won nearly every major award for young adult literature. The Giver is assigned reading in thousands of schools. The movie version with Meryl Streep and Jeff Bridges opened this weekend, and Pierre's Netta Ulaby has more.
The Giver's world is a scary, sterile world. Every person in this dystopian community must wear uniforms and take drugs.
Okay, I'm going to move to the poll question now, which is checking for your understanding. Which best describes the world of the giver in the passage you just heard? So this is exactly following a scripted instruction for teacher resources on Listenwise. And I'll give you a second to just go in and make your choice, see whether you were listening for some precise details going to the end. And I realize, I believe the answer is alive and colorful. I realize I didn't mark the correct answer. This is terrible. And I could not hear the clip, so I'll just preface it by that. So I'm going to ask.
I'm going to say, don't worry about it. I did the same thing in third period today.
Well, I know my colleagues are on the webinar, and she can chat with me and tell us the correct answer. But I think it was a scary and sterile world, because if you've read The Giver, I just know that from having read it a long time ago. But those were words that were used directly in the audio clip and help you have quick understanding of your listeners. So let's move on to another sample lesson. I'm going to turn it over to Scott, who's going to talk a little bit about critical listening and analyzing reasoning.
Okay, so just a reminder about the types of listening we discussed earlier. This is a story that can be used to teach students critical listening and analyzing reasoning. And to start, you teach students to listen critically for specific information that will inform their particular problem and hopefully provide a solution and highlight the reasoning behind why that's a good solution. So using the story Bee Deaths and Crop Consequences, students think about why the honeybee colonies have declined. They can then listen to the story and take notes on the multiple causes for the problem and brainstorm the possible solutions. So the first step is to select an audio story that poses a problem, and then you tell students, today you're going to be listening to a story that has a problem in it, and then you're going to evaluate the reasoning that led to the claims and solutions presented in the story. 2, you could present the purpose of the lesson as to use information from the audio story to find support for their reasoning about problems, and then again find the solutions that are posed in the audio. And then 3rd, you play the audio about the issue or problem and provide time for the students to discuss the story and process the information they just heard. You can kind of quiz them by having them identify the main assumptions and claims beneath the claims that are made. And then next, you can ask students to find evidence to support the claims that are made and connect them to their own ideas. That's a tricky one, getting students to connect their own prior knowledge to what's under study. And knowing how the claims are organized can help break the problem apart and respond to it, and then have students interpret the soundness or the clarity of the reasoning behind the data that the claims are based on, and if they are well reasoned. Next, provide students time to talk about the solutions that are presented and have them discuss or analyze whether they are logical. Is the information and the data relevant? Are there inconsistencies or gaps in the logic, errors in the logic. And then finally, as a class, you should discuss whether the problem and solution is logical, based on facts, and justified by the evidence presented in the story. My students always struggle a little bit with bringing in their own prior knowledge, but what I find is that really helps them develop their explanations for their reasoning, is to understand how they're following a particular chain of logic. So I think that's it for me on this slide.
Yeah, Scott, and that's one example of how to run a very deep and critical listening exercise with a class as a group. Another way now is going to this multiple choice online auto-scored quiz that we have on Listenwise. So here is an example of a quiz item that assesses a skill involved in critical listening point of view. The students listen to identify and evaluate the speaker's point of view or perspective. This speaks to the Common Core standard that talks about evaluating a speaker's point of view, reasoning, and use of evidence and rhetoric. It also addresses the SBAC Claim 3 evidence statement that the student will identify, interpret, or analyze the point of view, purpose, central idea, or key point of a presentation. So students' performance can inform your instruction, and let me show you how we provide data. So when you see here the question asks about which of these best represents the point of view of Stephen Carter, the person being interviewed. So this is a question 3 in a 5-question quiz that we have on Listenwise. And when a student goes through and answers the questions, there are 5 to 6 in every quiz, they will immediately get a come to a feedback page that looks like this. In this case, the student got 3 out of 5 corrected. It says keep listening, but you'll notice that as they receive this feedback on their quiz performance, they're also getting the correct answers, which can help them understand their errors and build the skills that they're developing. So, as Scott was demonstrating a way to do it in the classroom and getting that kind of feedback directly from the students, this is a way to do it all entirely online, either in a homework assignment or in a in a classroom setting. Now, what you get as well is a dashboard. And Scott, do you want to speak to this dashboard to talk about how this helps you see the data quickly from your students and how they did on these quizzes?
Sure, and I just want to preface it with the automatically graded quizzes are a godsend for overwhelmed, lazy teachers like me. My district requires us to give at least 2 grades a week, and I do a lot of writing with my classes, and sometimes it's hard for me to get through 150 essays. But a Listenwise quiz as a homework assignment related to what we're actually studying in class really helps in that area. And what you see here is that the dashboard, this is a report for a whole class, and you can click on the answers here where it's an X or where it's a check, and you can view the answer that your student selected and get an idea of their strengths and weaknesses. Like, for instance, my students always seem to struggle with main idea and inferring questions. So what I've tried to do is develop follow-up activities that involve the main idea and inferring things. And I'm a history teacher, but when I go next door and talk to my ELA teacher, she says the same things. These students have hard times doing inference questions, and they have hard times identifying the main idea. So I like to think of Listenwise a little bit as like a weightlifting program. It's just you keep going and building reps and increasing. We're moving on to the next slide. So this slide is the summary report, and it provides an overview of the performance by the comprehension skill. So that's what I was kind of talking about. Over time, you'll see this table get larger and larger with more and more responses, and it helps you drill down to explore this performance data and figure out what does it mean for each individual student and what does it mean for your whole class instruction. So you can create an intervention for the whole class or small groups, or individual students. And this view indicates that students, need more instruction and practice in several of the skills. You look at that main idea strand, and you can see with 38%, they're really struggling with that. Also with the collecting evidence at 38%, they're struggling with that too. So the nice thing is if you did this in class one day, you can then, boom, come to class the next day with an activity to follow up with either main idea or evidence.
And I also, showing a little bit about what this, you can drill down on a student quite deeply as well, right? This is the student dashboard view.
Right. So this is poor Maggie, and she struggled with the main idea. She struggled with the inference. She's also struggling with summarizing. But what you see here is we're only talking about 2 quizzes that Maggie's taken so far. And, last semester I gave my students over 10 different Listenwise quizzes. So the more you use Listenwise, the more robust your data and meaningful it is. And that's what you're looking for, especially when I talk to administrators and teams of teachers. They want to look and see how are teachers using this data to drive their instruction. And with Listenwise, you can just print out this chart for your principal or your instructional coach or whoever's asking you, how are you planning instruction? Well, I'm planning instruction because, Maggie's really struggling with main idea and inference questions. And if you really had to, you could customize it for the individual student. Again, I like to do some group activities for smaller groups and then give kind of a whole class debrief at the same time or to follow up.
Yeah, and I'll point out there is that download button, so you can download the data specifically on Maggie, or you can download the information and the data on the class. There's also the ability to have an administration login so that an administrator who's trying to keep track of several classrooms who are teaching and tracking listening can do so. There's also another way that we help assess students' listening skills, and that's in the written portion of the assignment tab on Listenwise. So there are 2 ways to assign a Listenwise story online. You can conduct listening instruction in the class in a variety of ways, but there are 2 ways to do online assignments. One is the multiple choice auto-scored quizzing, and the other is creating an assignment that's based on the pre-populated listening discussion questions that we have with every lesson. And once you create those questions for the students to complete, what you are able to do is give them feedback to their answers. So the platform allows teachers to provide the feedback on these open-ended listening comprehension questions, and teachers can ask students to even revise their responses based on that feedback. I also want to note that, a feature we just added that was popularly requested by teachers was the ability to wipe out the quiz grade and let your students retake the quizzing. Scott, I don't know if you've used that feature.
I have not. I'm pretty much collect data and then do another intervention type of person.
Got it. Well, there's another dashboard we have to assess, and that's the assignment dashboard. So if you create a written assignment for your students and you are doing it live in class, this view on your dashboard will allow you to see how students are doing in real time. So you can walk up to a student and check on their understanding and see where they're getting caught. It doesn't turn yellow until they've started to do some work and press save so that it then repopulates your dashboard. But this allows you to track students' progress on their written assignments.
And you better get on that Samantha and tell her to get started. If I was her teacher, I'd be making a phone call home.
So Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about some? Yeah, we're ready to move. I moved the slide to
okay.
You talking about some of the ways you've been using it and seeing success.
Yeah, this fall I decided I was just going to measure Listenwise assignments as homework assignments. And this was a problem of practice we have. I teach at a school for the high achieving and gifted, and students have to test to get into our program. And one of the things around gifted students is this great debate over homework. Are we giving them too much? Are we not giving them enough? And many of the teachers in our academy have complained that our gifted students seem to be particularly adverse to homework. If they don't think it's going to be worth a lot of points, if they don't think it's really meaningful to them, they just don't do it. So this fall, I assigned 10 Listenwise assignments as homeworks, and I did it every day, or twice a week. I had a Listenwise assignment on Tuesday and a Common Lit assignment on a Thursday, and I did it for all 135 of my students. And when all was said and done at the end of the semester, I had a completion rate with my Listenwise cohort of about 58% of the assignments. So my students only did 58% of the 10 assignments. Their scores from these quizzes were an average of 83%, which would indicate proficiency. But remember, the quizzes are usually very short, only 5 or 6 questions per quiz. And by the way, I just want to kind of reaffirm that this is exactly what testing should be: more frequent, lower stakes assessment. My students in particular, the allegedly gifted and allegedly high achieving, they go into a panic when they hear the word test or quiz, and they immediately start looking around for ways to either cheat or game the system so that they can be sure that they keep their A and they keep all their precious points. So I was a little depressed after I got this data because I thought this homework was interesting and it was pretty easy. And what students told me is it took them about 15 minutes to do a Listenwise assignment. It would take them about 30 minutes to do a Common Lit assignment. So with that disappointing data, I kind of flipped it. In this spring, I'm doing 10 Listenwise assignments in class that they can't get away from. So they really have to make a conscious choice not to do it. And I'm going to try and wait and see till the end of the semester if I get different results on either the participation rates or the quiz scores. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is when I take a deeper dive into the data from my Listenwise quizzes, I found that my students tend to choose the same wrong answer. Professional test makers call these distractors. So my students almost always go for the same wrong answer. And I was curious as to why they do that. And there's a gentleman out there named Myron Dweck who wrote a great book about grading, and he has a strategy called the I know I'm close technique. And what this does is students explain what their second choice would be and then explain why they would choose that for their second choice. So this is going to become a follow-up for me where I'll look at a question that the vast majority or a significant majority of this class got wrong, and I'll give them the I know I'm close technique, and I'll ask them to explain why they went for the wrong answer. And that's been pretty informative, and that also helps me see what prior knowledge do they have, what are they using to advance their reasoning down this certain logical train. And really all this, and certainly the work I do with Listenwise and their advocate program, what it makes me wonder is how are other teachers using their Listenwise data and how do they follow up with additional activities? I'm a little worried that nobody's using their data, that they just give the test and assign the grade and that's it. But when I go back through this and I ask students to reflect on their grades, I get a lot of really wonderful, nuanced answers. So I think that's
Scott,
it
I'm
for
going
this
to advance to the I'm going to advance to the next one because I want you to talk a little more deeply about asking students to how they respond to the data and also how you're responding to the data.
Okay, so you can kind of see, well, I think we skipped the slide, but when I first started using Listenwise, I was very interested in the connection between audio and reading comprehension. And so and I do a lot of speaking assignments too. And so I asked the class how they thought Listenwise was helping them. And my students said, you know, they overwhelmingly, over 70% of them agreed that listening to a Listenwise story before reading the textbook helps them understand the historical event better. And they also thought that the Listenwise content that they heard in class helps increase their understanding about the historical event. And one of the things that fascinates me about this is, I'm sorry, you can hear I'm at a real live school. That was just the bell in the end of the day. So one of the things that came about is that when students listen to something like a protest, the March on Selma, as they're listening to it, they're picturing themselves there. They hear the cops smacking their batons, they hear the fire hoses turning on, and they see and imagine themselves as being there. But when I play a grainy black and white video of that, students do not picture themselves there. They think this is an old, blurry, film that maybe my grandparents would be aware of, but they don't have as much empathy for those people in the video as they do when they're listening. So I thought it was kind of interesting to ask students to respond to the stories they're hearing in Listenwise. And I do use quite a bit the discussion questions as a springboard for greater inquiry. And there's another group called the Right Question Institute that has a procedure, a protocol called the question formulation technique. And now a lot of times what I do is I'll play the Listenwise story, and then that leads students into a QFT session where they're writing questions, they're brainstorming questions that they can follow up with for further study.
Scott, I love how you tell us that. Yeah, I mean, I love how you tell us how your students picture themselves there, because that is the immersive power of audio. That is part of what is going on neurologically when somebody listens. It is a research approach that's called be immersive in the audio that makes them feel that. And you're right, there's something about it being much more immediate and personal than seeing a picture or watching a video, because students can, in their mind, make a movie of what it's like and draw on all their background information to do so. So I love that you're bringing that up and sort of brings the webinar around to the important points about why teaching audio is so powerful and can be very different and more impactful than teaching, just doing reading and showing videos. So I want to, we're going to be wrapping up shortly, so I just wanted to make sure we get to a free literacy toolkit that can help you all with more strategies around listening comprehension. And one of my colleagues is going to put a link in the toolbar that will give you access to this, because we want to share this free toolkit that offers listening comprehension strategies that can be used in a variety of contexts with a multitude of audio stories, along with some sample lessons based on audio stories from the Listenwise connection. So we'll be putting that into the group chat, that link. And the other thing I wanted to encourage you to do is to just try a listening quiz. You can go on to listenwise.com/listening test, and without having to sign up or do anything, you could just take a quiz, see how good your listening skills are. And if you want to go deeper, though, if what you've heard today is interesting to you, to go even deeper, get some more practice in your classroom, for those who've attended this Listenwise, this webinar on podcasts and public radio and using data for your listening instruction, we're going to be offering an extended free trial of Listenwise Premium. So what you want to do is contact sales at listenwise.com, or Monica, that's me, at listenwise.com. And I want you to notice that in the left-hand side, too, we've got the link to the toolkit. Now we have just a couple minutes left, and I can see there's one question here for Scott. And one of our listeners, Laura, says, have you seen an improvement in your students' listening skills?
Oh, yes, quite pronounced. And I'm really mostly talking about their behavior first, but then from the behavior you see an increase in the skills too. And what I also see is this really helps my students who have reading deficits. They actually start increasing their comprehension by leaps and bounds. And it would be interesting to really analyze the data over time and be able to kind of compare the listening scores. In the state of California, we have listening strands that are measured by the SBAC, and I would love to see what my student scores are like and compare them to another teacher that's not using Listenwise and see if there's any.
Well, Scott, I can tell you, I can tell you that we have done that and seen data on that in other schools in California and seen a remarkable difference, many, many percentage points higher for the classes that are using Listenwise than those who are not. So I know we've got to wrap up our conversation. So I don't want to, because I know we'll be losing you all in just a few moments. So I want to just take a very last moment to thank you all, and especially thanks to Scott Petrie for joining me today on this webinar, and for all of you for attending. And please, we encourage you to go to listenwise.com and start listening tomorrow. Scott, thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Have a great day, everybody.